While modern billionaires race to build mega mansions, none have come close to the sheer scale of one monarch's vision, an architectural fantasy so audacious it was designed to eclipse every royal palace before it. This was not just a home, it was a statement, a declaration of dominance, and it would soon become one of Europe's grandest, most breathtaking creations. The year was 1664, and the man behind the dream was King Louis XIV of France, a ruler obsessed with power, beauty, and legacy. In an era when monarchs were not just leaders, but living gods, Louis envisioned a palace that would cement his authority for generations. A place so lavish, so meticulously designed, that it would leave visiting dignitaries in stunned silence. The goal? To craft a royal masterpiece that embodied absolute power. The site chosen was the sleepy village of Versailles, just outside Paris. At the time, it was little more than a hunting retreat surrounded by dense forests and open fields. But where others saw wilderness, Louis saw potential. He dreamed of transforming this land into a symbol of France's wealth and prestige, an imperial fortress wrapped in gold, marble, and the finest artistry of the 17th century. To bring his vision to life, Louis XIV enlisted the finest minds of his time. Architect Louis Levaux, landscape artist André Lenotre, and interior designer Charles Lebrun. Each man had already made a name for himself in the courts of Europe, but this was unlike anything they had ever attempted before. Their task: to craft a palace so magnificent that it would render all others obsolete. From the very beginning, the project was an exercise in excess. Vast forests were cleared to make way for the royal gardens, a landscape so intricate it would take thousands of workers decades to complete. The palace itself was planned with over 700 rooms, 2,300 windows, and 67 grand staircases, an architectural titan that dwarfed anything built before it. And then there was the Hall of Mirrors, a corridor of gleaming glass, gilded chandeliers, and breathtaking murals that turned even the most skeptical visitors into believers. This was not just a passageway. It was a monument to Louis' supremacy, where kings and ambassadors were forced to walk beneath their own reflections, reminded with every step that they stood in the presence of the Sun King himself. By the 1680s, Versailles had surpassed every royal residence in Europe. The Vatican, Buckingham, and the palaces of the Holy Roman Empire all now paled in comparison. The sheer cost? Over $2 billion in today's money. But Louis didn't care about cost. He wanted a legacy, one that would define not just his reign, but the very identity of France. Yet, no empire lasts forever. Though Versailles stood as a triumph of monarchy, the tides of history were shifting. The palace that once dazzled the world would soon become a gilded prison, and the power that built it would eventually crumble beneath the weight of revolution. What started as a dream of absolute power was about to face a nightmare of its own. For over a century, Versailles was the beating heart of European royalty, a dazzling beacon of wealth, power, and absolute monarchy. Other kings had palaces. Louis XIV had a universe. From the moment it was completed, Versailles became the gold standard of royal living. Nobles, diplomats, and artists alike made the journey to witness its grandeur. And upon arrival, their first reaction was almost always the same: utter disbelief. How could something so massive, so impossibly luxurious, even exist? To begin with, there was the scale. With over 700 rooms, 1,200 fireplaces, and enough gold leaf to coat an entire city, Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a self-contained kingdom. Every corridor led to a masterpiece, every chamber a work of art. The floors gleamed with polished marble, ceilings soared with frescoes that rivaled the Sistine Chapel, and chandeliers of pure crystal bathed entire halls in golden light. And then there were the gardens, arguably the most breathtaking in history. Designed by landscape genius André Lenotre, Versailles' gardens covered over 2,000 acres, stretching so far that visitors often needed carriages just to explore them. This was no ordinary backyard. It was an entire world of manicured hedges, sprawling fountains, and tree-lined pathways so symmetrical they defied nature itself. At the center of it all stood the Grand Canal, an artificial waterway so large that it functioned as an actual harbor. Louis XIV, never one to settle for ordinary, ordered full-scale naval battles to be staged upon its waters, complete with real ships and costumed sailors. But the true masterpiece, the Hall of Mirrors. Imagine stepping into a corridor where an endless row of chandeliers sparkles above, massive gilded statues line the walls, and 357 mirrors reflect golden sunlight from floor to ceiling. It was a spectacle unlike anything the world had seen. And that was the point. This wasn't just architecture. It was propaganda on a grand scale, a carefully designed display of power meant to overwhelm all who entered. Louis XIV didn't need to say he was the greatest ruler in Europe. He let Versailles do the talking. And talk it did. Within a few short decades, Versailles had reshaped European monarchy. Kings and emperors from across the continent rushed to copy it, each attempting to build their own version of the Sun King's masterpiece. Russia's Peterhof Palace, Germany's Sanssouci, and Austria's Schönbrunn all were inspired, if not outright imitated, from Versailles. Louis XIV had achieved his goal. He had set the standard. But behind the shimmering gold, behind the endless luxury, trouble was brewing. Versailles had not come cheap. The endless construction, the constant expansion, and the sheer cost of keeping thousands of nobles fed, entertained, and housed drained the French treasury at an alarming rate. Even the famously extravagant Louis began to feel the weight of his own creation. And then, in 1715, the unthinkable happened. The Sun King died. For the first time, Versailles, the palace that had once seemed eternal, was left without its master. And though it would continue to reign as the symbol of French monarchy, its golden age was already beginning to fade. What followed was a slow but steady decline. A palace once built to celebrate power would soon become a prison for kings, a symbol of excess that would spark one of the most violent revolutions in history. The grandeur of Versailles had reached its peak. Now, all that remained was the fall. Versailles had once been the shining symbol of absolute monarchy, a palace so grand, so impossibly extravagant, that it left visitors breathless. But power is fragile, and what had been built as an eternal monument to the monarchy was about to become its greatest liability. The cracks in Versailles' legacy began long before the Revolution. Louis XIV may have been the architect of its greatness, but his successors, Louis XV and Louis XVI, were inheriting a financial disaster. The lavish court life, the endless parties, the maintenance of over 3,000 servants and 5,000 nobles, it was all bleeding France dry. And outside the palace gates, the people were starving. By the time Louis XVI took the throne in 1774, the French economy was on life support. The palace that had once been a beacon of strength was now a grotesque reminder of the monarchy's detachment from reality. While Versailles' elite dined on roast pheasant and the finest wines, commoners in Paris were rioting over the price of bread. And then Marie Antoinette arrived. History would paint her as the villain, though in truth she was more of a scapegoat. The young Austrian queen was beautiful, elegant, and entirely unprepared for the ruthless world of Versailles. She had no real political influence, but she knew how to spend money. Her personal retreat, Le Petit Trianon, became a private escape from court life, a place where she could pretend she was a simple country girl while still surrounded by silk, jewels, and hand-fed livestock. To the struggling masses, it was an insult. Rumors swirled. Pamphlets depicted her as a self-absorbed queen, wasting the country's last coins on dresses and diamonds. One phrase in particular would stick to her name forever, despite the fact that she never actually said it. Let them eat cake. By 1789, the tension had reached a breaking point. France was bankrupt. The monarchy had lost control. And then, an angry mob marched to Versailles. On October 5th, 1789, thousands of revolutionaries stormed the palace, furious at their king and queen, demanding change. The royal guards fought to contain them, But Versailles, once the fortress of the monarchy, was now a prison. The mob pushed forward. Marie Antoinette barely escaped through a secret passage as armed revolutionaries invaded her chambers. Outside, rioters demanded the royal family face them, and they did. The next morning, King Louis XVI, Queen Marie Antoinette, and their children were forced to leave Versailles forever. The once magnificent palace, home to over a century of kings, was abandoned. For the first time since its creation, Versailles stood silent. But the worst was yet to come. Revolution had begun, and soon the very symbol of France's monarchy would face a fate even its creators never could have imagined. Versailles, once the ultimate symbol of monarchy, power, and divine rule, was now a hollow shell. The French Revolution had done what no army ever could. It had shattered the monarchy's grip on France. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were dragged to Paris, imprisoned, and ultimately executed. Their royal court dismantled. The palace that had once housed thousands of nobles and servants was now little more than a ghost town. And then the real destruction began. Versailles in the aftermath of revolution. In 1793, revolutionary forces declared Versailles a relic of tyranny. The very people who had once marveled at its gold and marble now saw it as nothing more than a bloated symbol of oppression. Looting began almost immediately. Priceless furniture, chandeliers, tapestries, anything that could be taken was ripped from the walls and auctioned off. Revolutionary officials sold off over 17,000 artifacts, dismantling centuries of history piece by piece. What couldn't be sold was simply destroyed. Royal portraits were slashed, statues were smashed, and entire rooms were left to decay. The once pristine Hall of Mirrors, where kings had basked in their own reflections, now stood eerily empty, its grandeur fading under layers of dust. The gardens, once the envy of Europe, became overgrown and wild. The fountains, once powered by brilliant engineering feats, ran dry. The Grand Canal, where Louis XIV had staged naval battles, was now nothing more than a stagnant pond. Versailles was rotting before the world's eyes. Napoleon's attempt to save Versailles. And then, in 1804, a new ruler rose to power. Napoleon Bonaparte, the self-proclaimed Emperor of France, saw Versailles not as a relic, but as a weapon. He understood the power of spectacle, and Versailles was the greatest stage of them all. At first, he considered making it his imperial residence, but even Napoleon, with his boundless ambition, saw the impracticality of it. Instead, he restored portions of the palace and used it as a political showpiece, a place to impress foreign dignitaries and remind them of France's royal legacy. But his empire was short-lived. By 1814, Napoleon had fallen, and the monarchy returned briefly under King Louis XVIII. Yet Versailles was no longer the center of power. The French court had permanently relocated to Paris, and with it, the palace's relevance faded into history. The slow death of Versailles. For the next several decades, Versailles became a palace without a purpose. French rulers came and went, but none chose to live there. The grand halls remained empty, the vast ballrooms silent. Even the nobility, once desperate to be at court, had abandoned it. Instead, Versailles was repurposed. Some rooms were turned into military barracks, others into government offices. The Hall of Mirrors, the very room where treaties and alliances had been formed, was now a dusty relic of the past. And then, in 1871, Versailles faced one of its darkest moments yet. The palace becomes a war zone. The Franco-Prussian War had left France humiliated and broken, and in a final insult, the German Empire was declared inside the Hall of Mirrors. That's right. The very place where Louis XIV had once flaunted his power now served as the birthplace of Germany's greatest rival empire. The irony was not lost on the world, but war would strike Versailles again. During World War II, the palace barely survived the German occupation of France. The Nazis, aware of its historical importance, used it as a headquarters, but largely spared its destruction. Still, bombs fell dangerously close, and every day there was the fear that centuries of history could be erased in an instant. Versailles had been a palace, a prison, a political weapon, and now a war relic. And yet, through revolutions, wars, and abandonment, it still stood. But for how much longer? As the 20th century dawned, Versailles was in ruins, its once golden walls crumbling, its treasures scattered across the world. It seemed destined to collapse under the weight of history. That is, until one last, desperate fight began, the fight to save Versailles before it was too late. By the early 20th century, Versailles was on the brink of collapse. Once the crown jewel of European royalty, it had become a decaying ruin, its walls crumbling, its treasures scattered. The palace that had symbolized absolute power was now a forgotten relic. The man who refused to let Versailles die. Enter Pierre de Nolhac, a historian who arrived in 1887 and was horrified by what he saw. Versailles, once the center of the world, was rotting away. Determined to save it, he launched a relentless campaign, tracking down lost furniture, restoring grand halls, and convincing the French government that Versailles was worth preserving. His efforts began to pay off. By the early 1900s, Versailles was officially turned into a national museum, but funds remained scarce. Restoration was slow, and entire sections of the palace were still in ruins. Then, help came from an unlikely source: America. Rockefeller steps in. In 1924, John D. Rockefeller Jr. visited Versailles and was shocked by its condition. Seeing its global importance, he personally donated $2 million, over $30 million today, to fund critical restorations. His generosity saved the Hall of Mirrors, repaired the fountains, and revived the gardens. His gift inspired others. Soon, donors from around the world contributed to the restoration, breathing new life into Versailles. Surviving war and the final push. Then came World War II. Fearing destruction, curators hid priceless artifacts while bombings threatened the palace itself. Miraculously, Versailles survived. In the post-war years, restoration efforts accelerated. The 1950s and 60s saw entire wings restored, rooms reopened, and lost treasures returned. By the 21st century, Versailles had undergone its largest restoration yet, bringing back its full splendor. A place reborn. Today, Versailles stands as a masterpiece once again. The Hall of Mirrors gleams, the gardens flourish, and the fountains flow just as they did centuries ago. The fight to save Versailles was long and difficult, but in the end, it was a fight worth winning. Now, millions walk its halls every year, witnessing history preserved for the future. Versailles had survived revolutions, wars, and decades of neglect, but its story was far from over. The palace that once symbolized absolute monarchy was about to experience its greatest transformation yet, from a forgotten relic to one of the most visited landmarks in the world. The largest restoration in history. By the late 20th century, Versailles had been partially restored, but much of the palace still bore the scars of time. The French government, along with international donors, launched the most ambitious restoration project in its history. Decades of decay, pollution, and weather damage had left parts of the palace on the verge of collapse. Restoration teams worked tirelessly, repainting ceilings, repairing marble floors, and reconstructing crumbling facades. The Hall of Mirrors, long faded and dull, was finally returned to its former brilliance. Outside, the once abandoned gardens were revived, with fountains brought back to life and thousands of trees and flowers replanted in their original designs. Versailles was no longer just a historical site, it was a living masterpiece. Versailles in the modern era. Today, Versailles is one of the most visited palaces in the world, drawing over 8 million visitors per year. Its halls, once reserved for kings, now welcome people from every corner of the globe. Beyond being a museum, Versailles has become a cultural hub. It hosts prestigious art exhibitions, concerts, and historical reenactments, breathing new life into its centuries-old halls. Even Hollywood has played a role in its revival. Films like Marie Antoinette and The Man in the Iron Mask have showcased its grandeur to global audiences, a legacy that lives on. Despite its turbulent past, Versailles stands stronger than ever, a monument not just to France's royal history, but to the resilience of art, culture, and human ambition. From its golden age to its darkest days, Versailles has remained a symbol of grandeur, power, and perseverance. And through every revolution, every war, and every century of change, one thing has remained true: Versailles is eternal.